Welcome to this explainer. Grief is something literally every single one of us will face at some point. But what happens when it just refuses to let go? Today, we're jumping right into a truly fascinating intersection of psychology and biology. We're going to explore how emerging neuroscience is offering us a profound, completely new way to understand and, more importantly, to heal prolonged grief. We're going to look at the actual physical, biological mechanisms that trap us in sorrow and the incredibly surprising chemical key that might finally unlock them. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's start by looking at a reality that so many people face. We all know grief is a universal human experience, right? And usually, normal grief is a process that is eventually supposed to have an end. But for about 7 to 10% of bereaved individuals, the data shows that the grief just doesn't naturally fade over time. Instead, it becomes a locked neural state. The brain effectively gets stuck in this agonizing loop of acute loss, and it completely resists conventional treatments.
Which brings us to our first core concept, when grief gets stuck and the sheer weight of that loss.
So, to understand how to actually treat this, we first have to grasp the core difference here. Normal grief is a time-limited, progressive process. It involves the brain doing the really effortful, deeply painful work of updating its predictive model of reality. It's effectively rewriting its internal world to adjust to one that no longer contains the person who was lost. But then we have prolonged grief disorder, or PGD, which, by the way, was just officially added to the psychiatric manual in 2022. PGD is a locked state. It's intense yearning, emotional numbness, and severe avoidance lasting well over 12 months. In PGD, the brain simply refuses, or maybe is completely unable to update its worldview.
Let's transition over to the biology of this locked brain and the actual anatomy of that loop.
If you want to explore exactly what is happening when grief gets physically stuck in our neural pathways, we have to look at the prime suspect, the default mode network, or DMN. Now, this is the brain network responsible for self-referential processing, autobiographical memory, and basically constructing our ongoing self-narrative. In a healthy brain, the DMN is flexible, but in stuck grief, the default mode network becomes rigidly locked. It traps the individual in this relentless oscillation, swinging violently between an intense, consuming yearning for the deceased and an absolute avoidance of the crushing emotional weight of the loss. The narrative becomes completely fixed. The brain literally cannot process the reality of the person being gone.
And there is a truly cruel biological irony at play here. Researchers have actually demonstrated that in the bereaved brain suffering from PGD, the reward center, specifically the nucleus accumbens, shows abnormal activity. It activates when exposed to reminders of the deceased. This literally mimics addiction reward circuitry. So the brain is processing reminders of the lost person exactly like an addiction craving. This keeps the person trapped in a constant state of frustrated desire, a biological loop of craving, even when their conscious, intellectual mind knows full well that their loved one is gone.
So the big question is, how do we disrupt this neural loop? Enter the psilocybin key.
Finding a way to break this loop is exactly what brings us to psilocybin as a powerful neurodisruptor. Psilocybin isn't just masking the pain or, sedating the patient. It acts directly on the exact neural architecture that maintains that stuck grief. By stimulating specific serotonin receptors, a process known scientifically as 5-HT2A agonism, psilocybin dramatically disrupts DMN coherence. What does that actually mean in simple terms? Well, it means the network temporarily loses its tight hierarchical control over the brain's processing. It is essentially forced to release its rigid grip on that fixed, yearning narrative of loss. This is the exact same biological mechanism through which psilocybin has been shown to disrupt the ruminative loops of depression and the compulsive patterns in addiction. It temporarily uncouples the locked brain. And this profound chemical disruption leads to staggering clinical results. Think about this. In a landmark study by researchers at Johns Hopkins involving patients with life-threatening cancer and deep existential distress, a state that very closely overlaps with the death anxiety seen in PGD, 80% of patients showed clinically significant reductions in their distress at a 6-month follow-up. That response rate is astonishing. It vastly exceeds anything achieved by conventional treatments for this specific population. And we aren't just talking about a fleeting temporary mood boost here either. At that 6-month mark, 60 to 80% of participants were categorized as meeting the criteria for full remission. Even more remarkably, parallel trials and long-term follow-up studies confirm these profound therapeutic benefits are sustained for 4.5 years post-session. 4.5 years! This proves we aren't just looking at symptom management. This is a fundamental, durable rewiring of how the brain relates to loss, non-existence, and mortality.
But we need to talk about the mystical experience catalyst and what it means to confront the void. Because to truly grasp the mechanics of this treatment, we have to realize that the chemistry is really only half the story. We absolutely must look at the profound psychological experience that actually catalyzes this healing. Across the clinical trials, the strongest predictor of therapeutic success wasn't just the exact dosage, it was the intensity of the mystical experience reported during the session. This experience is characterized by a complete dissolving of normal ego boundaries and a transcendence of time. This psychological state essentially bypasses the immense terror, death anxiety, and defenses that maintain prolonged grief disorder. It doesn't just give patients a logical intellectual argument about death. Instead, it allows for a direct, deeply felt encounter with their loss and mortality from a vantage point of total openness. It's the pharmacology creating the exact, precise conditions needed for genuine emotional processing.
So how do we build the new reality? Let's break down the PSI framework.
It is absolutely vital to note that the drug itself is merely a catalyst. Turning that profound, boundary-dissolving experience into durable neural change requires a highly structured clinical container. And that brings us to the PSI framework: preparation, session, and integration. This structure proves that this is a rigorous clinical protocol, not just some casual experience left to chance. Step 1 is preparation, where therapy works to explicitly identify the individual's specific stuck points of grief, those exact unresolved fears and avoidance patterns. Step 2 is the session itself, which becomes a directed emotional confrontation with those precise points under the influence of psilocybin. And step 3 is integration, where specialized therapy helps consolidate those massive experiential shifts into lasting neural reorganization.
Let's zoom in and look closely at the biology of that integration phase. After the session, the brain experiences a massive spike in neuroplasticity. This is driven by an upregulation of a protein called BDNF. You can think of BDNF almost like fertilizer for new brain connections, helping neurons grow and adapt. Now, this BDNF-driven plasticity peaks about 24 hours post-session, meaning the brain is at its absolute most capable of rapid structural updating. But crucially, this elevated neuroplasticity window remains open for up to 4 weeks. This is exactly why intensive integration therapy during this specific timeframe is so absolutely critical. It actively uses that 4-week biological window to construct the new reality and physically rewire the patient's relationship to the loss before the brain settles back down into its normal state.
This represents a total paradigm shift in bereavement. We are moving way beyond sedation.
We're witnessing a fundamental shift in how medicine approaches this debilitating condition. We're moving away from conventional treatments that just try to sedate or mask the symptoms of grief toward a therapy that actually treats the biological root of the locked state. There's an incredibly powerful observation in the literature that puts it like this: psilocybin does not treat grief by suppressing it. It creates the neurological conditions under which the brain can complete grief. I mean, that perfectly captures the very essence of what we've been exploring today. This therapy isn't about forgetting the deceased, and it isn't about numbing the pain with daily medication. It is about temporarily unlocking the rigid networks of the brain so it can finally complete the agonizing but entirely necessary process of integrating the death.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this highly provocative thought. If we can temporarily unlock the brain's rigid networks to actually heal prolonged grief, how else must we rethink our modern medical approach to mortality and mental health? I mean, if neuroscience and psilocybin can literally unlock our darkest, most stuck emotions, allowing us to finally face the existential terror of death and loss, how might this permanently reshape the entire future of human healing? It's a massive, profound question, and one I really encourage you to keep exploring. Thank you so much for joining me today to dive into this incredible science.